Lecture 8, World War I and the Middle East.
In the last two lectures, I described Jewish colonization efforts of Palestine. 2 lectures ago, I described the first Aliyah. In the last lecture, I described the second and third Aliyot, along with the fourth Aliyah. The fact that I decided to put in the fourth Aliyah in that lecture, along with the second and third, of course, is an innovation that many of my colleagues don't do. I think it's important now that we understand that there were a variety of strains that fed into modern Israeli politics, as I'm sure Ariel Sharon and Menachem Begin would also agree. Symbolically, there is a way of demonstrating the fact that this is the case, and it is the case that, similar to Theodore Herzl's reinternment that took place under Zionist auspices, Vladimir Jabotinsky was also reinterred under Zionist auspices. Jabotinsky was originally buried in New York, and in 1964, the body of Jabotinsky was returned. I'm falling into that particular phrase, was reinterred in Israel. Jabotinsky was reinterred at the request of Menachem Begin, who would later go on in 1977 to become the first Likud Prime Minister of Israel. Thus, according to one Israeli historian, quote, the ceremony symbolized both the normalization of relations between labor and the political descendants of the revisionist movement and the beginning of the latter's political rehabilitation and legitimization. So much for the moment for Zionist colonization efforts. What I want to do is once again expand our focus to look at what was going on in Palestine as a whole and situate that within the world system. I want to talk today about World War I and its effects on the Middle East. On the 18th of June, 1914, the heir of the Austrian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was shot while visiting Sarajevo by a Serb nationalist. With the endorsement of Germany, Austria presented an ultimatum to Serbia, and then, when the Serbs agreed to the ultimatum, the Austrians declared war anyway. As protectors of the Slavic peoples, Russia began mobilization to back the Serbs. Germany, Austria's ally, mobilized. And then, in order to avoid fighting both Russia and France at the same time, decided to launch a knockout blow against the French through Belgium. Britain was committed to Belgian independence as part of the concert of Europe. World War I had started. Now, when we think of World War I, we generally think of trench warfare on the Western Front in France. It is important to understand, however, that World War I was truly what its name suggests, a world war. As a matter of fact, one could look at the way this term World War I has come into play. The British and the French, for example, called the war initially the Great War. The Germans were the ones who actually understood that it wasn't just a great war, that it was a world war. In other words, the Germans were the first ones to understand that what was at stake was a war against rival empires whose economic well-being made them dependent upon their colonial possessions. Thus, battles, skirmishes, raids, closing down of radio stations, etc., took place throughout Africa and parts of Asia. It should come as no surprise, then, that of all the combatants that fought in the First World War, France, Britain, Germany, Russia, United States, of all these combatants, the Ottomans suffered the highest proportion of casualties, the highest per capita losses. Now, World War I is arguably the most important political event in the history of the modern Middle East for three reasons. First was the creation of the state system. Prior to the war, the Ottoman Empire ruled juridically, if not in fact, much of the Middle East. They ruled Anatolia, which is the site of present-day Turkey, the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, much of the Arabian Peninsula, and a small sliver of North Africa. In 1918, the Ottoman Empire was no longer there. It was gone. The victorious Entente powers had taken the Ottoman Empire apart, and in its place, what political units were things like the Republic of Turkey, in the place of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, the Fertile Crescent states, such as Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, had been divided up between the powers of the time, the French and the British. They weren't quite states yet, but they were in the process of being formed as states. And Egypt was on the verge of getting its independence. So the first effect of the First World War was the creation of the state system in the Middle East. The second effect of the First World War was the emergence of the, quote, Palestine problem, unquote, for the first time in its modern form. Zionists got, during the First World War, what they had sought: international recognition. Remember, the First Zionist Congress had advocated, quote, to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. Well, during the First World War, they got it. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Jewish immigration increased dramatically during the interwar period, particularly in the 1930s. And as a result, there was widespread poverty, there was widespread landlessness, let's put it that way, among the Palestinians, and Zionists clashed with Palestinian inhabitants of the region in ways that were very different in scope than anything that had occurred before. The third effect of the First World War was that varieties of nationalism began to spread throughout the region. Now, as we stated previously, the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century, particularly during the latter part of the 19th century, attempted to strengthen central control to meet challenges from abroad. They attempted to strengthen central control by creating institutions and by pursuing policies that were modeled on the institutions and the policies of European nation states. At the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire, that big tent that united Arabs, Turks, and other peoples, was gone. It had disappeared. Now it was up to the diverse peoples who had previously been Ottomans to apply themselves to what they had learned under the Ottomans in the way of forming new national communities. Thus, we see the emergence of an assortment of nation-states, an assortment of nationalisms spreading throughout the region in the wake of the demise of the Ottoman Empire. In the upcoming lectures, we will discuss how nationalism evolved and spread among particularly the Palestinian population. Therefore, if we were to compare a map of the Middle East in 1918 with a map of the Middle East in 1914, we will be struck by one very important feature. The Ottoman Empire no longer exists. It's no longer on the map. Although the European powers had nibbled at the edges of the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century, the so-called sick man of Europe, as Tsar Nicholas referred to it, had entered into the 20th century weakened but still intact. The concert of European powers had both managed to protect their interests in the Ottoman Empire and to diffuse crisis after crisis through diplomacy. Only once during the 19th century did European nations come to blows over an issue that took place within the Ottoman Empire. That was during the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, at which point the French and the British, along with the Ottomans, went to war against the Russians. There had been in Europe a concert of European powers that was able to diffuse all the crises that emerged with regard to the Middle East, time and time again. But that concert of European powers began to break down with the emergence of Germany as a unified state in 1870-71. And so, with the rise of Germany, what we see is the disruption of the concert of Europe. Now, the end of the concert of Europe in 1914 heralded the end of the Ottoman Empire. On the eve of the First World War, European nations divided themselves into two alliances. The Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia, and later the United States, and there was a host of smaller states involved as well, formed one of the alliance systems, while Germany and Austria formed the core of the Central Powers, as they were called. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers for several reasons. First, because there was large amount of German political and economic influence in the empire. And the second reason why they joined was because of the traditional Ottoman hostility toward Russia. We'll get into that in a minute. In addition, the Austrians, who were anxious to control Ottoman ambitions in the Balkans, actively solicited the Ottoman Empire's participation in the war on their side. There's an old Saudi Arabian saying, it's better to have a camel inside your tent peeing out than a camel outside your tent peeing in. The Austrians obviously regarded the Ottomans as that camel. So the alliance systems, Britain, France, Russia, and then later the United States, Austria, Germany, the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, of course, the Entente didn't try very hard to get the Ottomans into the empire, into their alliance. They did not regard this as a world war yet. They felt that the war would be over pretty soon before the Ottomans could play any role in it whatsoever. And they also felt that the Greeks and the Italians, getting the Greeks and the Italians on their side was more important than getting the Ottomans on their side. The Greeks and the Italians wanted territory that the Ottomans had, and they felt that they could, the Entente powers felt that they could attract Greece and Italy to their side by promising them that territory. Now, it soon became clear that the war would not be over by Christmas. The Battle of the Marne, the race to the sea, trench warfare, etc., etc. The war soon bogged down. As the war bogged down, each of the Entente powers began to look at the spoils that they could get from the Ottoman Empire in the event of an Ottoman defeat. In other words, they looked toward the division of the Ottoman Empire among themselves. Now, what spoils did these powers want? Well, for Russia, it was obvious. Russia had dreamed since the time of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great of access to warm water ports for a full year. In other words, they had ports that were not frozen over in the summertime, but the problem was they needed ports that would be open all year long for international trade. And they figured that they could get these ports by laying claim to the Turkish Straits. After all, 37% of Russia's exports passed through the Straits at this time. As far as Palestine was concerned, the Russians wanted to ensure access to the Orthodox Church for Orthodox pilgrims to sites that were holy to the Orthodox Church. So the Russians wanted the Turkish Straits, which meant, of course, Istanbul. I tell my students all the time that whenever they think about Russian policy during the 19th century, one phrase should come to mind, quote, relentless drive south, unquote. Not drive south, but relentless drive south. France also had what it considered to be historic claims in the Middle East. Particularly, France was interested in the area that now includes Syria and Lebanon. France based its claims to interest in this area on its long-standing association with Lebanon's Maronite Christian population. The Maronites are a sect of Christian, very, very close to Catholic, that inhabit Lebanon. The French, of course, being Catholic themselves, felt a strong bond with the Maronites. The French also had economic interests in the region, such as investments in railroads and, just as importantly, the silk trade, upon which the city of Marseille, in part, depended. Britain, on the other hand, its objectives were pretty much all over the place. As a matter of fact, after the war started, they had to put together a commission called the de Bunsen Commission that looked at what we are fighting for in the Middle East. And they came up with this long laundry list of things that the British wanted from the Middle East in the event of an Entente victory. They had a long-standing obsession with the protection of the sea routes to India, of course, which was of predominant British concern. British strategic policy based upon the route to India lasted in Britain until 1968. Those of you who know about Indian history know that India got its independence in 1948. Sometimes policymakers are pretty slow on the uptake. Britain also wanted to ensure post-war security for investment and for trade in the region. So, starting in 1915, Entente powers began to negotiate a series of secret agreements with each other. And they made pledges to each other and to groups outside the Entente to confirm their claims and to attract into their alliance systems other states, such as I said before, Greece and Italy. Now, the agreements that the Entente powers drew up among each other and with other groups divided up the territory of the Ottoman Empire. The agreements were reached, of course, without any regard for the wishes of the local inhabitants. And there were a number of these agreements, which I really won't burden you with now. They, frankly, have gotten probably more attention than they're worth. What's important to note, however, is that many of these agreements and pledges that the Entente powers made to each other and made to powers outside the Entente, many of them were mutually contradictory. For example, the territory that we now associate with Palestine, for example, was promised to France in 1915 as the southern part of Syria, and Syria would go to France. It was promised to international control in 1916. The Russians insisted on that. It was promised to a future Arab state in 1916. The Arab Revolt, if you remember, the Arab Revolt led by Peter O'Toole, Omar Sharif, and those people. The Arab Revolt was basically working with a family from Arabia. This family got a pledge from Great Britain that they would support a future Arab state that would include Palestine. And then Palestine was also pledged to the Zionists as well in 1917. Now, in the end, the territory that now is Israel, Palestine under the Palestine Authority, and Jordan was handed over to the British under something called the Mandates System. We will go into more detail on the Mandates System in the next lecture. Suffice it to say right now that the powers that got territories abroad, which were known as mandatory powers, the ones that got the territory abroad, were given temporary rights over that territory to prepare the citizens of those territories for, quote, the strenuous conditions of the modern world, unquote. You just see the very patronizing attitude of British and French diplomats very cynically slicing up the world into their own spheres of interest after the First World War for this purpose. The idea was that once a territory had reached a level of, quote, civilization, commensurate with Western Europe's civilization, it would become independent. One's actually reminded of Mahatma Gandhi's comment when he was once asked, what do you think of Western civilization? Gandhi said, I think it would be a great idea. The idea was, of course, that the West would prepare these states, would civilize these states, and make them prepared for becoming full-fledged members of the international community. That, of course, was the official line. In reality, the mandate system was nothing more than a fig leaf for continued colonial rule over territories that previously had eluded colonial domination on the one hand, and it was a way now of making sure that these territories would be under colonial domination in an age that began to have certain ambivalences about colonial domination of foreign peoples. Now, for the sake of this lecture, I want to talk about the most important pledge that was delivered by the British government during the World War I in terms of the future Arab-Israeli dispute. That, of course, is the famous Balfour Declaration that was promulgated in November of 1917. The Balfour Declaration is actually quite interesting. It was a small notice placed in a newspaper. One would be aghast if he or she were living in 1917 to see exactly the importance of this tiny little blurb that was put into the Times of London. In July of 1917, Baron Lionel Rothschild of the philanthropic family, Rothschild family, submitted to the British Foreign Office a draft resolution that was prepared by the English Federation, the English Zionist Federation. The resolution pledged British sympathy for Zionist aims. Lord Balfour, in the name of the British government, issued this pledge that had been already written by the English Zionist Federation, committing the British government to support of Zionist goals. Now, why would the British do something like this? This has been one of the great debates in diplomatic history for a long time, ever since it occurred. There are a variety of reasons why, and you could pick and choose whichever one you like the best. For example, there are strategic reasons, perhaps. Some in the British government saw the advantage of having pro-British Jews living on opposite side of the Suez Canal from British occupation forces in Egypt. In other words, this would be a way of ensuring that there would be British control over the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal, of course, was essential to maintain British supply, the British route to India. The second thing is a strange flip side. The second reason why the Balfour Declaration probably was issued is a strange flip side to British anti-Semitism, actually. British ruling circles tended to overestimate Jewish power in the United States and in Russia. Britain wanted very much, in November of 1917, to attract the United States into the Entente alliance. And they also wanted to keep Russia very much in that alliance. Remember, this is the exact period in which Russia was undergoing its own revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, the idea was that the British thought that Jews had a great deal of power in the United States because Woodrow Wilson had among his top advisors people like Felix Frankfurter, Louis Brandeis, people such as that, people who were associated with the American Zionist movement. And they felt that, the British felt that by supporting Zionism, what they would be able to do is to get the United States to look very warmly on British war aims. On the other hand, the British also felt that the Bolshevik movement, after all, is nothing more than a bunch of Jews anyway. And so all they had to do was to promise the Russians that they support Zionist aims, and the Jews who were leading the Russian revolution, according to the British government, would, of course, immediately say, hey, they like Jews, so let's keep in this war after all. Anyway, that's another theory as to why the British issued the Balfour Declaration. A third idea is Protestant Zionism. Those of you who remember Jimmy Carter's presidency remember the sway in which Zionism can hold over people who were Protestants, or who are Protestants, and fundamentalists as well. And the Prime Minister of Great Britain was a Methodist, and so therefore had a great deal of attraction toward the Old Testament. Now, what was the Balfour Declaration? What did it say? The Balfour Declaration stated quite simply, and it's so short it's shocking. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. That's one sentence. That's the Balfour Declaration. You should notice the following about the Declaration. When we talk about UN Resolution 242, we're going to talk about why the UN Resolution 242 was so clearly ambiguous. Same thing goes with the Balfour Declaration. For example, there are several things about it that are worth noting. First of all, the Declaration is just that. It's a declaration. Declarations really hold no weight in international law, particularly since international law is based upon relations between states, not between states and non-state actors, such as a Zionist movement. Secondly, His Majesty's government view with favor. What does view with favor mean in reality? It's an extraordinarily vague term. But here's another one for you. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Okay. Two more words, or several more words. Why use the word in Palestine? Why not just say of Palestine? Let me read the sentence in that way. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people, and how, listen to that, and think about the way it was actually written. View with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. In other words, the British are leaving themselves a way out, not promising the entirety of Palestine for the Jewish people. And anyway, what is a national home? You can look in any international law textbook. The words national home do not appear. The words are unrecognized in international law. It is obvious that the British were avoiding the use of the word state, much as what many Zionists were avoiding as well. Zionists tend to refer to what they were trying to do is build a Jewish commonwealth. Okay? And finally, why say, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. What exactly is the meaning of that? What are the British anticipating by using that phrase? Nevertheless, the announcement submitted by the British government provided the first real diplomatic success for the Zionist movement. It also became part of the juridical foundation for the State of Israel.